welcome to 15 Minutes with Longevity. This week we're going to be looking at food labeling and what you as a consumer should be looking out for when it comes to the labels on your food. Earlier this week I met registered dietitian Melissa Kelly at the William Nicol Pick and Pay to look at food labels in order to know what I should stay away from. Let's go take a look. Beef lasagna. What should we be looking for in a label, Melissa?
You know, if you do label reading on any product, you shouldn't just use the information to simply classify it as a good or a bad food. Use the information to get perspective on this portion of food and how this can fit into your diet. Firstly, you'll see that the list of nutrients, you get macronutrients and then you get your dietary fiber and your sodium, and it's always listed per 100 gram and per 300 gram. According to law, there are many important information that should occur on a label. From a dietetic point of view, if you look at for nutritional value, first of all, look at what size is the portion. So you would see this is a 300 gram size portion. So then you look at the 300 gram column and you would see what you are actually getting when you eat the whole portion. If you look at your cheese on the shelf and you take the label in your hand, I think the first important thing about cheese is your fat intake. Look at this low fat chunky cottage cheese. Total fat content is 4 grams per 100 grams. So that is a low fat product, and the saturated fat is 3 grams per 100 grams.
So that's very good.
Very good.
Yes.
Compare that with a normal hard cheese, a Gouda cheese, and you would see that the total fat is 31 grams. Now, I mean, compare that to 4 grams.
Wow.
And you look at the saturated fat of 18.8 grams versus the 3 grams. Big difference in fat intake.
Okay, so I'm back in the studio and joining me today is Yolande van der Ruit. She's a nutrition specialist from the Consumer Goods Council of South Africa. We went to a local supermarket with a dietitian, and I went up and down the aisles and we just randomly selected different foods to have a look at what kind of labeling was on these foods. And we took everything from a kind of dry food all the way to a drink, a fruit drink. So my first question to you, because some of the stuff that we saw on the shelves quite frightened me quite a lot as a consumer and also as a journalist, because what I saw was there was a lot of incongruency. There were some products with detailed descriptors of what type of salt, sugar, even what kind of colorants were in the actual product. And then on other products, there was nothing at all, Yolande. So the first question I have for you is, what are the rules governing food labeling in this country? I mean, are we allowed to have product on the shelf that doesn't tell you what kind of salt there is in it?
What we can mention is in 1993, South Africa published its first food labeling regulations. But obviously in the international and national arena, a lot has changed since then. So what we ended up with was the publication of the newest food labeling regulations, and the name is R146. And that was published in 2010. Mm-hmm. Now it has been amended twice since, but in essence it's a very large document. The old regulations were about 38 pages. This one is about 210 pages.
Is that a good or bad thing?
I think it's a good thing. Like, it's a lot of reading, and industry then has a lot of responsibility on their shoulders. But I think the golden thread that runs through R146 is protection of the consumer, and ultimately also of the food industry. If they adhere, then they can use that as evidence. To answer your question, there's various stipulations. There's a lot more now in terms of allergen declarations, a list of ingredient declarations, whether that nutritional table that you sometimes find, whether that should be on the label or not, and when that is. These regulations govern claims, nutrient content claims, vegetarian claims. There's a whole list of definitions to make it more clear what certain terminologies mean when you use the regulations.
Okay, so I'll give you a good example. I mean, we picked up a can of corned beef, which a lot, is quite a product that I think is quite a mainstream product. On the one product, there was a detailed label. There were no claims made. It didn't say this was low in fat or healthy or anything. And on the other product, there was nothing at all. So how is it that in one category you can have a situation where one manufacturer or seller of goods is being responsible and the other one isn't? And how does the consumer, again, the consumers are not that well educated to know that.
I think I'd like to distinguish between the list of ingredients versus the table. All labels have to have a list of ingredients. So you have to tell consumers what's in the product when it comes to whether it's meat or soy or additives.
Or
That's
donkey or whatever.
Correct. That's a given.
Okay.
But when it comes to the table, that is voluntary and only mandatory when claims are made. And with claims, I mean when anything is said like low in fat, high in vitamin C.
So let's, again, we don't have a product in front of us. The table really tells you how much salt or fat or sugar is in it. So what you're saying is on the ingredients, they can just say salt, colorant, sugar, maize or whatever, but they don't have to put any percentages or anything.
Unless claims are made. Then there's a certain table that has to be on, which then serves as substantiation for the claim.
Okay. Now, I mean, is that right? Because again, you know, I know there's a lot of differing research around food labels. A lot of people say people don't even bother reading the labels, but we have this growing obesity epidemic in this country, and hypertension and rising blood pressure and diabetes. And this is having a massive impact on the quality of South Africans' lives. And I'm sure that if a lot of South Africans knew what was in the food they were eating, especially stuff that they just pick off a supermarket shelf, they would probably be able to manage their lifestyles a lot better. But, you know, are we really helping them? It doesn't seem that we're helping them very much at the moment by not having that kind of rule around showing what is in it.
Well, I think if they don't do it currently, it's not wrong, but it's obviously not advised because, as you say, it is obviously ideal to encourage industry to give that information to consumers. So we advise our members to put on those tables, to give a little bit more information. And who knows, maybe newer phases of the food labeling regulations could very well address this aspect and make it a mandatory requirement going forward.
I mean, I think the one category that was really a concern were the fruit drinks, because number one, I think a lot of people believe because it's fruit, it's got to be healthy. We saw a product, I mean, the amount of sugar that was in this fruit drink and artificial preservatives and that, you probably would have been better off drinking Coca-Cola. You know, we all know that there's this big mission around soda drinks, you know, around the world to bring down the consumption. Yet really it looked like we should rather be drinking something else instead. This is a drink that I think a lot of mothers, for example, put in their kids' school bags. Very high in sugar, no nutrient value at all. But again, you're saying no protection.
I think one has to remember that the Department of Agriculture regulates the composition of fruit drinks. So there's something in place to look at composition, the percentage juice, water, etc. But when it comes to the labeling, they have to obviously declare sugar as an ingoing ingredient. And then the regulations have been tightened around claims which state something like no sugar added or no added sugar. They will not be able to make that claim in future if any type of sugar, not just fruit sugar or table sugar, but if any sugar is ingoing. So that kind of claim will not be visible on fruit juices in future.
And one of the things that I think would be very helpful for consumers as well is to make it simple, like saying 2 teaspoons instead of grams. I know that we love to use grams and milliliters and all of that, but how many people sit and convert that in their heads when they're looking at a food label or thinking about a product? I mean, do you think that would ever come to pass that you could pick up a product and it says 9 teaspoons of sugar in it?
It's an
10 teaspoons of salt?
It's an interesting theory, and I think that is where I would encourage consumers to give comments when legislation is published for public comments. We know that phase 2 of the labeling will be published in the near future. And this is where consumers have to do their part and say, as a consumer, I'd easily understand teaspoons instead of grams. Why don't you make recommendations? It's not law yet, but it's certainly a very interesting concept.
Just very quickly, I mean, we could talk for ages on this subject, but we are very time bound. What can consumers do to better protect their health in terms of food labeling in this country? As an organization which is there to protect consumers, can you just give me, say, 3 good tips as a consumer, or 5 if you've got?
I think first of all, read the labels. We're all hurried when we do shopping, but it's our responsibility to know what we put in our bodies. So read labels, first of all. Secondly, if you don't understand, ask, whether it is your retailer or a dietitian, or maybe contact the Department of Health or the manufacturer directly.
How do they contact the Department of Health, by the way?
We could always make the contact details available. Should people want to know, they can contact me directly.
Is it an online or is it a telephone service?
There's telephone numbers, there's email addresses. They deliver a service when the other duties allow. So, but I think the safest is go to the manufacturer or the retailer and ask. And then I think also read up at credible sources. Be careful what sources you use to familiarize yourself with. Rather base it on science and on someone that knows what they're talking about, instead of going to a little bit of questionable sources, because a lot of consumers get quite hyped up. But I think reading labels is the most important one, because ultimately that is the tool you use to decide what you're going to buy and what not.
And probably if you're a consumer and the label isn't detailed, you should be wary.
Absolutely.
I mean, surely the buyer should be wary
Absolutely, and then go for a rather more trusted brand.
And then I find something wrong, or I discover somehow that, you know, the claim that they've made doesn't quite equate. What do I do?
Think first port of call, again, the retailer, and then one can always take it back to the manufacturer. I know a lot of the manufacturers that we deal with are very willing to engage with consumers if they're not happy and to resolve the matter satisfactorily, so that there's no need for something to escalate into something dramatic. Many of them are. So I think a retailer as well, if they don't know how to help a consumer, then escalate it. And I know the legislation also now states that there should be a lot of transparency to consumers when it comes to allergen and ingredient declaration specifically. So if there's an uncertainty, ask.
Okay. So just I think in summary, let's all be much more aware, check your labels. It's not got if it hasn't got the detail on it, don't buy it. Got a problem, go to the retailer, the manufacturer, and your counsel. What role do you play?
Our council is Consumer Goods Council. So in other words, we assist the food industry with various legislations, amongst others. We're kind of also like a spokesperson between your industry and your government. So we kind of make sure that the industry takes the law and implement it correctly. And we also create platforms where there's concerns so that these various parties can sit around a table and find resolving to the ultimate, obviously, of the consumer.
Okay. So I think we'll go back to holding the manufacturers to account for their products.
Amongst others, yes.
Okay, great. Thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you.
Well, that's all the time we have for this week. I hope to see you here again next week for your dose of health news. Goodbye.